All right, thank you everybody for coming today. Jim Peterson is the unit leader and associate professor of Oregon Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Oregon State University and adjunct professor at the University of Georgia, University of Montana, and Oklahoma State University. He currently teaches 3 graduate level courses at OSU and mentors Ph.D. and MS graduate students at postdoctoral researches. His research centers on multi-scale modeling animal populations, monitoring and population estimation, and their application to natural resource decision-making. He has more than 90 peer-reviewed publications and recently published a book titled Decision-Making in Natural Resource Management, a Structured Adaptive Approach. It was recognized as one of the best professional and scholarly publications in environmental science by the Association of American Publishers. Please welcome Jim Peterson.
Thanks, Ben. Before I get started, I'm going to explain a little bit of what I'm doing today. And that is I'm going to make an argument. I'm going to make an argument that research, monitoring, and management should all be fully integrated in order to be effective with natural resource management. And when I talk about that with a colleague of mine, Mike Conroy. Both wrote the book together. And we talk about it as the three-legged stool. So hence the title of my talk. Several folks, I'm going to talk to you about some projects I worked on, had a lot of input from a lot of other people over a number of years, and here they are right here. Especially when I highlight Adam Duarte, postdoc of mine, and Mike Conroy, who I've worked with for the last 15 years on a lot of this research. All right, so a lot of times when I meet with managers or meet with researchers, I'm working at a university, there's this sort of idea that research and management and monitoring are sort of distinct endeavors, right? Management, you're turning dirt, you're doing stuff on the ground, all right? Monitoring, we're just keeping track of what's going on. And then research, well, that's really getting back to the basics or understanding the fundamentals of how the system works. I really think about that as more or less a false trichotomy, right? They're complementary, all 3 endeavors. All 3 are important to conservation. And if you lose any one of them, it's going to disrupt the other 2. So I'm going to step back for a second and say, okay, what do I mean by management? Well, management, I'm talking about taking an action to obtain some desired resource outcome. It's going to require a range of actions that you can take. So if there's only one action, there's no decision to be made, right? And an objective or set of objectives that you want to achieve. So let me give you an example. My objective is to increase fish population size in, say, a particular river. The only decision set I have, the only knob I can turn is maybe minimum flows. So let's think about this as a series of models going from a really bad way to do it to a much better way to do it. So think about it, firstly, in sort of the worst way. If I increase flows, then habitat increases. And a lot of times when I work with managers, that's what I hear from them. That's my objective. When I ask the question, well, you just spent $100 billion and you increased habitat by 1 square meter. Is that worth it? Let's be a little more precise about what the management action is going to do. So an even better way of doing that would be if I increase flows by X, then habitat availability increases by Y%. So at the very least, we can compare what we thought was going to happen with what actually did happen. However, that's still disconnected from the objective, that is increasing fish population size. So an even better way of doing it is if I increase flows by X, habitat availability will increase by Y, and the population will increase by Z, or whatever that particular number is. So now you've gone from your management action through your mechanism to your objective. And you can actually link and determine if you were successful with your management action in terms of the thing that you really care about. You only care about habitat because it might be a means to getting to your real objective. So why do we need a model? Why do we need a model to connect decisions to objectives? Well, a fundamental assumption that I have is that all management is based on models, right? You have habitat or population targets, you identify threats. My question always is when I work with folks is how did you get those values, right? How did you get them? What were your assumptions? You know, what effects did you consider? Which ones did you eliminate as not being important? How did you determine that one action was better than another action, right? You used a model. Now, it might be in your head. It might be this thing called a black box between your ears, and it would be based on biological knowledge, which is good, but you still use some kind of model. So let me give you an example of what I call different decision models. These are ones that I typically work with groups. Maybe you have a recovery plan. That's more of a narrative model. There's a lot of fuzzy language in there, what we call linguistic uncertainty. All right, we have environmental assessments, all these EISs, all these things, threat matrices for endangered species planning. These are all sort of forms of models, but the problem is how do they handle uncertainty? How do they incorporate uncertainty? And how do we evaluate their assumptions? So I could give two different biologists a spreadsheet. They could fill out a threat matrix. And my guess is you're not going to get the exact same answers from two different individuals, or maybe even one individual at one point in time. Test that person again at another point in time, they might give you a different answer. So this brings into a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fuzziness that gets caught up in decision making. So uncertainty in decision making, it's important to incorporate uncertainty in decision making, right? It affects your objective. You know, you might pick up the decision that maximizes the value on average, all right, the expected value, but you'd also like to reduce uncertainty if you can, right? Because it's going to improve decision making. So learning is going to improve how you do things in the future. So learning is going to have value in terms of resource objectives. So when I mean uncertainty, I'm talking about two basic types, what I classify as reducible and irreducible uncertainty. Irreducible uncertainty is things like environmental variability, demographic stochasticity, that no matter how much you study the process, there's still going to be that variability. You're not going to be able to reduce that uncertainty. You have to make a decision this year. You don't know what kind of water year it's going to be. You know, it might be a wet year, it might be a dry year, but you need to make a decision this year. And no amount of study is really going to improve your ability to predict or understand what's going to be like next year, or at least relatively to the amount of resources you can put into it. Whereas reducible uncertainty, epistemic, we're talking about statistical uncertainty, observational error, and when I'm going to talk about structural uncertainty in a minute here, with additional study, or by improving or understanding or learning what's going on through management, you can reduce that uncertainty and improve decision making. And of course, linguistic uncertainty, we work really hard. Numbers are very precise versus things like bad, good, 10, 15, that's very much better, much less uncertainty associated with numbers as opposed to sort of fuzzy words. So a very often overlooked source of uncertainty is something we call structural uncertainty or system uncertainty. Sometimes people call it ecological uncertainty. And it's due to our incomplete understanding of system dynamics. So whenever I come down here, I hear from people, hey, we know we just need more water, more inflow into the delta to, say, increase population size. So I submit to you that that relationship, you know, more water with increasing population size can take an infinite number of functional forms. And I have three functional forms shown right here in this figure. So for example, if you think that it's a nice linear increase like this solid white line right here, that each proportional increase in flow is going to increase your objective, your population size. However, if this dotted green line, this asymptotic relationship is what it looks like, then depends on where you are in terms of delta inflows and how much your budget has. You know, if you're right here in this point, it would not be worth increasing water because you're not going to get any bang for the buck versus at this point. Again, with this one right here, this lower model right here, the sort of exponential model, you see that if you can't increase flows beyond a certain point, you're not going to get any response out of the population. Whereas after another point here, boom, it goes up quite a bit. So if you can't increase inflows beyond this point, you better be looking at another knob, another decision to make to achieve your objective. So this is a really important source of uncertainty. And the problem is when you fail to incorporate this sort of system uncertainty, we get this idea of dueling models, right? Whose model? My model is better than your model. And we don't need to do that. We can incorporate multiple models into decision making. And in fact, with monitoring data, we can figure out who's better at predicting, who's right, who's wrong, or if everybody's wrong, or if everybody's right. So the sort of solution that people have come up with is really from the decision sciences field. It can be called decision analysis, people call it structured decision making, and then adaptive management is sort of a special case of decision analysis, structured decision making. Right? It was developed in the 19th century, the sort of field of decision making, scientific decision making sort of emerged in the late 19th century, really took on in the early 20th century, primarily used in sort of operations, business, planning, things like that. Some early adopters for natural resource applications were Carl Walters and Buzz Holling. They sort of pushed forth or presented this idea of adaptive management. And then in 2007, the Department of Interior adopted this as adaptive management and structured decision making as the tool to manage lands and resources. So that's the official policy and has been in DOI since 2001. So there's two types of adaptive management, and it's important to keep these straight. There's the experimentalist resilientist school of adaptive management, where you treat management as experiments. You have hypotheses, you have controls, you have treatments, you might have a back-E monitoring design that tells what the effect size is. Examples of that, Grand Canyon Adaptive Management Project, the Platte River Adaptive Management Project, and the Missouri River Adaptive Management Project. Then there's the decision theoretic school of adaptive management. That's the school that I favor, where you do management to meet your objectives and learn at the same time. So it doesn't require what we call probing or perturbing the environment. You can learn through time. What we use is alternative models and predictions, and we use management to invoke changes to try to meet our objectives, and monitoring to compare our model predictions to what actually happened. Examples of that, North American waterfowl harvest. That is entirely decision theoretic adaptive management. It's probably the largest scale adaptive management that I know of, at least in the Western Hemisphere. There's the horseshoe crab red knot adaptive management, where horseshoe crabs are harvested for hemolymph. For medical applications, red knot is an endangered bird species that requires the roe from these horseshoe crabs in order to survive their migratory journey. Least chub, a project I worked on, prairie grasslands by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and temporary wetland management by Fish and Wildlife Service refuges. So adaptive management is sort of a special case of structured decision making we call dynamic structured decision making. It requires something known as sequential dynamic decision making. It can be either in time or space, alternative ideas of how the system works, an information state, which we can talk about in terms of model weights, which model's right. I think it's 50-50. I think both models are equal. And it looks like this, where you have the system state, what is the current condition of the system? You have the information state, how do I think the system works? Based on those, you make a decision. Based on that decision, you have predictions under alternative models. You compare your predictions, what actually occurred, and then you revise the information state. You update the information state. Using that revised notion, you go through time, and you're beginning to evolve that information state. So in this form of adaptive management, model predictions and monitoring data have to communicate. They have to talk to one another. They have to be perfectly seamless in how they are integrated. Same spatial and temporal units, same measures, same units, all right? If you're talking about population size, you can't use an index of population size unless you somehow develop a crosswalk, whatever that happens to be. But they've got to be in the same units. And that is where integrated population models come into this. So integrated population models, almost always when we're working with managing animal populations and plant populations, there's almost always an underlying population model within that, whether it be a meta-population model, an individual-based model, whatever it happens to be, where we have population size at time t is related to t plus 1 is related to time the population time t plus births plus immigration minus deaths minus emigration. Quite often when we do build these models, we do monitor populations, we usually get parts of the puzzle, right? We get some maybe population size or index of population size, maybe survival, maybe we get estimates of animals moving in, and then we try to put this thing together to try to create a decision model. And usually the results of our monitoring efforts are things don't quite fit and things are missing a little bit, right? So that the model isn't perfect. It's okay, but it isn't fully integrated. So that brings on the use of integrated models. And I would argue with you that the future of decision analysis or structured decision making and adaptive management is tied up heavily in these integrated models. And I'm going to illustrate that with a case study with water management and the Oregon spotted frog. So the Oregon spotted frog, of course, it's in Oregon. It's been listed in 2014. Right now it currently has a stronghold in the Upper Deschutes Basin. The Upper Deschutes Basin, the water is needed for, you got that? Thank you. Water is needed for human use. It's a very heavily irrigated area. There was a lawsuit and an injunction in 2016 which tried to save the water for the frogs. So the idea there is that the water's low when it should be high, when they're holding back water for irrigation, that strands the spotted frog eggs. Spotted frogs can't reproduce successfully, and we have a problem. So that's what the lawsuit's all about. So we worked together with folks from the Fish and Wildlife Service, USGS, and the Forest Service to start developing our objectives and some management alternatives and come up with a model. So some of the management alternatives we looked at was manipulating river discharge, maybe doing some excavation to lower the floodplain so the water be more in contact with it when the frogs were laying their eggs. Maybe some vegetation control around these wetlands because they're filling in with vegetation. Bullfrog control because bullfrogs are believed to prey upon Oregon spotted frogs, and then translocation. I'm going to give you an example of a translocation decision that we recently published. So the Oregon spotted frog life cycle, we have adults, males and females reproduce.
Can I interrupt for a minute?
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No,
We're
go ahead.
having audio issues on the people online.
Sure.
Sorry for the interruption. Can the people online hear me now? Testing, testing. Can you hear me? Who remembers our science cell phone or science line number? 877. Anybody? 402-9753. Oh. Great. Thank you for those chatting and helping. We appreciate it. Okay, thank you. All right, back to the presentation.
So the Oregon spotted frog life cycle, adults reproduce, they create eggs. Eggs hatch to tadpoles. Tadpoles turn to metamorphs or juveniles. They then become pre-breeders. There are usually 2 to 3 years between the time they emerge, become terrestrial, and the time they actually breed. And we don't necessarily observe each one of these things, right? We cannot mark juveniles with permanent tags. Typically, they clip the toes if they're going to do any mark recapture or anything like that to get abundance estimates, but the toes regrow back. So there's a lot of unobservable processes that are going on in the system. So what we did with the folks, with the Fish and Wildlife Service and some of the USGS folks, is we developed some conceptual models about how the system works. So we treat these conceptual models. This one happens to be the egg to tadpole survival model, so that represents one of those arrows in the life cycle model. And they had some hypotheses as to what affected egg survival. And there are a series of these models, things that affected juvenile survival, adult survival, immigration, etc. So our modeling objective, we have these hypotheses. We want to confront them with data. Is we want to develop a model that accommodates uncertainty, but enforces parsimony. So I showed you this model earlier. Look at that. Look at all the parameters in there. That's a lot of parameters. And typically, when people put together some of these models, these conceptual models, they are over-parameterized. You don't have enough information. So we want to enforce a little parsimony and be able to evaluate some of these hypotheses with data. And that's what we're doing. We want to be able to confront that with data. And basically allow the models to be updated through time with monitoring data. So to give you an example of what data we have, in the upper Klamath Basin, they tried to reintroduce a population of Oregon spotted frogs in the Klamath River Refuge. And they did this in 2007. They monitored these things, counts of egg masses, did some capture-recapture with permanent tags in adults, and did some capture-recapture with toe clips and juveniles just to get juvenile abundance. They monitored them from 2008 to 2016. And this is Mike Adams, who's a collaborator on this project from USGS. So what do we have? We have counts, and we have average clutch size, can give us information about the total number of eggs that are laid. We have marked juveniles, and we can use something known as the Huggins closed capture estimator to estimate juvenile abundance. And we have marked adults that we can use something known as a Cormack-Jolly-Sieber estimator to get estimates of survival and capture probability. With an integrated model, what we can do is combine these different sources of information into a single model and estimate things that we didn't observe. So for example, we did not observe egg to juvenile survival. But with this integrated model, through a Bayesian framework or MCMC, we can map eggs into juveniles the following fall. We don't see juveniles. Once they disappear, they really don't pick up these what we call subadults that are in the population. So we have no way to estimate this transition, the survival estimate from adults, but in an integrated model framework, we can map directly the juveniles into the adults and get an estimate of this survival probability, this transition probability. So we did this and fit this in wind bugs, and we used the parameter estimates from this model, where we were able to test some hypotheses, use the parameter estimates from the final model, the best approximating model, to parameterize our decision model. And then we solved our decision model using something known as the translocation decision, stochastic dynamic programming. What that looks like is this is called a policy plot. So on the x-axis, we have the abundance of the donor state. On the y-axis, we have the abundance of the recipient population. So this is the donor population for a translocation. This is the receiver population that would get those individuals. Each one of these individual boxes represents assumptions about metamorph survival. So one thing I want to show you is these different colors represent how many you would translocate. So in this upper box, we're not translocating any except for this zone right here where you're translocating 25 individuals under this survival. Now notice as I increase the survival, what I think the survival, metamorph survival is, annual survival is, it's changing what decisions I would make for different combinations of abundance of the donor population and abundance of the recipient population. So for example, if I thought that survival was as high as 0.744, which it could be, that was the upper end of our confidence limit in that parameter, I might do something like, if the donor population, there's only 25 to 49 individuals, the recipient population, there's 0 to 24 individuals, I might decide to translocate a few of those individuals. Whereas if I think survival is really low, I'm not going to translocate any of them. So this key uncertainty is the information state I told you about, which is known as metamorph survival. So what I could do is I could solve this problem with something known as adaptive stochastic dynamic programming, and then I'd come up with an active adaptive management policy would differ a little bit from this. And what that would do normally is that it would make me do something a little bit different so I could learn faster. In this instance, this is just passive adaptive management, meaning we're not anticipating learning going on, learning simply a byproduct of management. So how do we figure out which uncertainties matter? What we usually use is something known as sensitivity analysis, right? It tells us, what would I do differently if I knew X? So for example, if I knew truly what metamorph survival was, instead of a distribution for metamorph survival, the lower 95% confidence limit, the upper 95% confidence limit, what would I do differently? In that instance, it showed you different policies based on what metamorph survival was. You can also use it to prioritize research and monitoring. And in fact, sensitivity analysis can tell us what do we need to know and how much do we need to know in a currency that is valued by decision makers. So you can do something called calculate the value of information, because information does have value. So let me show you an example of that. For my second case study, it's water resource management in the Southeast, and this happens to be Georgia, Florida, Alabama. Increasing water demand, the whole region's exploding, increasing urbanization, water impoundment, climate change. In the 9 years that I was there in Georgia at the University of Georgia, they were in drought more than half of those years. So there's a lot of things going on in that system. So a project was initiated to look at developing tools for evaluating stream flow requirements or ecological flow requirements. So we met with multiple stakeholders, including NGOs, including state folks, federal folks. Stakeholders want us to look at multiple species. They wanted dynamic models. The information needs would be huge if we were thinking about developing a demographic rate, an individual species model with individual demographic rates, multiple species, multiple demographic parameters. It would have been a very difficult thing to do. The stakeholders also wanted spatially explicit predictions. So what's going to happen in this stream segment based on stream flow that gets in there? So that leads us to a problem of increasing model size and complexity, which would make it very difficult to solve even with simulation, right? There's a state space of that model that the decision space basically would be very big. So a lot of uncertainty and the need to integrate with monitoring. So Georgia DNR, all the other states do annual stream monitoring. So we need to be able to incorporate, that would be our source of information. So we developed an integrated conceptual aquatic model that had flow regime components, sediment delivery, channel change, channel condition, biological productivity, water quality, temperature, etc. At the heart of that model, the biological response of that, we modeled using a patch dynamics model, where each patch was a stream reach, and stream reach was tributary junction to tributary junction. So what we had was, you had a model, we could estimate the probability that a species persists, reproduces, or colonizes a stream reach as a function of channel type, stream size, location in the network, the seasonal hydrothermal regime, etc. So right now we're just tracking, is it there? Did it reproduce? And we could feed that into the decision model, then estimate what's going on with the response of the populations to stream flow management. So to give you an idea of what that kind of looks like, and this was a 2013 or 14 paper that we published and then followed up with. If we look at, I have two alternative ideas of how the system works. And this is parameterizing with empirical data, this idea that median seasonal flows affected extinction or local extinction within a reach, or acute low flows affected extinction in the reach. Now what we could do is we could model by combining these two and creating a composite estimate. But look at the difference here. If you think this is how the system works, you think it's chronic flows, you can take quite a bit of water out without having much of an effect on the population. And the y-axis here is the change in fish species richness as a function of daily water withdrawal in million gallons per day. Whereas if you think this is how the system works, you really can't take much water out without having a pretty big effect on the population. Now I could turn this around and I could go to a decision maker. Say, for example, the city of Thomaston, which we did. And these are the water managers, and they don't care too much necessarily about the fish. What they want to do is to increase the water that they can take in for their community. They're just south of Atlanta, so they're growing. And I want to make a pitch to those decision makers and say, hey, listen, we need more study of this system. These are the understanding that we have, and based on the understanding we have, if it works one way or the other way, you could have a really big impact by increasing your water use, or a smaller impact by increasing your water use. So we went and talked to fish biologists, and we said, Let's put a little constraint and say how many species on average are you expecting a reach below the water withdrawal to be reduced? What's okay? What's acceptable? And let's say it's 4% or 5% of species. That's roughly a species blinking on and off every other year. It's really not that big of a deal. They thought that was okay. So let's look at that sort of 5% level right here. So if this is how I think the system works, I can only take about 1 million gallons per day. If this is how I think the system works, I think I can get about 3 million gallons per day. So this information has value in terms of million gallons per day that are valued by those decision makers. So as part of this process, what you can do is I can estimate the value of that monitoring data in a currency that the decision makers care about. So we could go to the decision makers in the city of Thomaston, the water folks, and I can do some simulations to find out what the expected error of my estimates are going to be. And if I did some 2 samples occupancy estimation, my error rate, coefficient of variation is going to be about 35%. If I did 4 sample occasions, it'd be much lower error, coefficient of variation about 10%. If I assume the true richness, given the estimated richness of 25 or 25 plus or minus 4, that's what that error rate would give you. If the true richness is 25, it would give you 25 plus or minus 2 species to give you an idea what that error means. I can estimate the value of that sampling information. And if I do it, okay, pay us to sample on 2 occasions, guess what? The expected value of that sample information is 0.26 million gallons per day. If you give me money to sample on 4 occasions and I get a better estimate, the expected value of that sampling information is 0.49 million gallons per day. So lo and behold, wow, you mean if you resolve these uncertainties, we might get more out of the system? That's the idea. So when you make a pitch for what should be monitored, or you want to figure out what should be monitored, we can put it in a currency that you care about. If it's delta smelt, you can put it in delta smelt. If it's green sturgeon, you can put it in terms of numbers of green sturgeon. For the CVPIA, with initial sturgeon modeling results, they had 4 hypotheses about what they thought affected sturgeon recruitment. I said, if you can resolve that, the expected value of that information is something like an additional 1,020 adult sturgeon by year 20, something like that. So you can put it in currency that people care about. So that's the idea of sensitivity analysis within a decision-making framework. So what do we do with that if we do monitoring? Well, we get money to do it because we convince these decision makers you can get something out of it. And that funds students. This is Rachel Katz. This is part of her Ph.D. project. And we wanted to reduce that uncertainty. So she did sampling with her crews 2011 through 2013. In the late summer, it coincided with the estimates from the model, so it's fully integrated. She sampled 21 sites, did electrofishing and seining, and actually did 2 to 3 visits, occupancy per site, and she focused in this area called Potato Creek, which is where the city of Thomaston is. So we simulated or predicted occupancy from that 2000-2013 period using modeled flows, because we didn't have, they had a gauge in the lower end of that basin, not where there were, so we worked with some USGS folks, Laura and Hayes shop, to model those flows. We used a software program that I have called Metapop to model the metapopulation dynamics. We then took the observed data and we estimated occupancy with it using JAGS, a little Bayesian estimator. And we then compared the model predictions to the monitoring data and we updated our model weights. So in this framework, we actually had 2 hypotheses that said what affected local extinction. We had 2 hypotheses about the colonization dynamics. Was it tributary dispersal, or did most of the individuals come from what we call the main stem? We kind of copied metapopulation theory and called that mainland island or main stem island sort of an approach. So the different combinations gave us 8 alternative models. We compared the observed and predicted values under those alternative models with what we observed in the monitoring data, and we updated those model weights. It started off with equal model weights using Bayes' rule and a binomial likelihood. So here's just a subset. We had 48 species, and this is a paper that we just published last year with Mary Freeman, and I think I had a citation earlier. And what we had was that the trends, at least in terms of these model weights, were generally monotonic. Whereas, sort of we were learning through time. So this is the tributary dispersal model, posterior weight, so it's really limited movement. For some of these individuals, say, let's see, right here, this sunfish species right here, in 2000, and this is 2011, 2012, 2013, 2011, we thought for sure that tributary dispersal was the right model. However, through time, we began learning that no, it probably is not the right model. So after updating these model weights, this was our prior composite model where we weighted 50-50 for everything. Here is our posterior model weight. This is what we learned. So this is how this distribution changed. The state could then say, okay, based on this composite model, we're going to allocate this amount of water for you, or we're going to allow you to withdraw this amount of water from the system. So back to my analogy of this sort of monitoring, management, and research, or modeling. I like 3 M's better, so I'll just call it modeling. If you disconnect management from monitoring, meaning they're not fully integrated, and what I mean by that is you have to look at your monitoring data and make decisions based on that at some interval. Maybe it's an annual interval. Like the frog thing, it might be something different. Maybe every 5 years you're going in, sampling the frog population, looking at what that is, the donor population is, looking at what the recipient population size is, and making a decision from that policy plot. Right? If you disconnect those things, there's no basis for judging how the system's responding, right, with relation to management, right? There's no ability to test model predictions or resolve uncertainties, to resolve, contests between models, right? And it really doesn't provide a basis for learning. Eliminating or disconnecting research, right? You get sort of this ossification of management, right? You don't try anything new, you don't incorporate anything new, right? New ideas don't become part of management, right? They need to continually come into that, and it sort of perpetuates, like say, this culture of separation from management and science. And what I find out when I do work with a lot of groups, a lot of interdisciplinary groups consisting of researchers and managers, is there's this notion that research and management are competing for resources. Well, this sort of approach really provides the basis for identifying those key uncertainties, figuring out how to best optimally allocate your resources between sort of research, between management, with those what you're going to implement, and between monitoring. If you eliminate management from this whole thing, right, decisions are made by default, right? You're just going to use what you've continually been doing already, right? You just status quo, status quo, status quo. Monitoring and research programs don't have any value if you disconnect them from you disconnect research from management, connect management from monitoring, whatever happens to be. Monitoring doesn't have any value. Learning really slows, and it might occur if you sort of monitor the system in terms of management, but if you're not doing anything new, it doesn't provide opportunities, learning opportunities, to compare what you thought was going to happen with what you actually did see happen. So final thoughts on the sort of benefits of these integrated models, right? We can estimate vital rates, and vital rates are important because most of these decision models, they're going to have embedded some kind of population model, right? When there's no data or little data, you can actually estimate transitions for which you never observed. The estimates are more precise. You can evaluate competing hypotheses simultaneously. You're accommodating uncertainty. You're enforcing parsimony, which is huge. And then it facilitates updating. So, right, you could read that data right in, your monitoring data right in. You can see what happened, what you thought happened, and reduce uncertainty. So it's integrated fully within that framework. And essentially, this is also, we're developing an integration population model as part of an effort with CVPIA for salmon management, for Chinook salmon management. And then we're going to try to do the same with the steelhead work and things like that. So we're going to try to take that monitoring data and get it to match with the model so we can update things just like that. All right. Any questions?
But I imagine with your experience, you've got a lot of circumstances where integrating has policy and budget implications. That is, the managers don't want to share their budget with the researchers, and even though the objective would be improved if they integrated, their budgets would not be improved. And CVPIA is a great example where a lot of money has been spent with less than expected impact on fish and more than expected impact on Bureau of Reclamation PYs. What's your experience with that? How do you deal with that?
Well, starting out, I'll say we started with the CVPI work. We started with what happened to be an expert model that we parameterized, and there's some folks in the room that were part of that. We then went through the whole sensitivity analysis and everything else, and then what it showed was that there's these lots of uncertainties that are really important, in particular juvenile survival and a few other things. The program said, well, we're going to probably try using this to manage with. Well, there was discomfort, I guess I'd say, with respect to using that model and that approach. So probably we want to put a few more resources to improving the research end of it. I think because when they talked about the possibility of using it and making people live with this, people saw that and said, whoa, 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 this better be better. This thing better be better before I'm going to let you use it to try to prioritize restoration actions or, things like that. So I think sometimes it takes that impetus to sort of push people a little bit and show them the value in doing that, and that there are trade-offs, right? We could just guess, which is what we essentially did. And if you're not happy with that, then we have to put some resources that go toward this effort. Caesar, would you say that's about fair?
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk. In everything you've mentioned, it puts a tremendous weight on managers, decision makers. I assume those are the same thing. In my experience, managers, with some exceptions, and there are a few in this room, but managers don't have the wherewithal or the time to not only understand the models and understand the value of different models and the nuances that they really need to understand in order to come up with some kind of view about how to go forward. They need to be talking to each other. It's really kind of a deal that they need to make among themselves with their disparate interests and values. What is the job description in your mind of a manager / decision maker?
Job description? Well, they're giving us general guidance as to what's the set of decisions they have to make, and then they need to look at the evidence, meaning the monitoring data, whatever happens to be, right, and figure out what resources they have to put toward whatever objective they're trying to achieve, and then pick that alternative that best meets their objective within their either legal or budgetary constraints.
They don't have that time, and they don't put it in, generally.
Mm-hmm. What happens a lot of times, see, again, what you try to do is you try to instill a process, right? And that process can occur on some regular interval. It doesn't require daily this. So I'll give you the best example, the North American Waterfowl Harvest Adaptive Management Program. They would get together, different flyways, and before this was implemented, and would argue for a week, an entire week, over what the regulation should be. When the populations declined severely in the 90s, late 80s, 90s, they were looking for relief. So they looked at a few folks, Jim Nichols, Ken Williams, so the folks said, okay, you've been talking about this thing, let's hear about it. So now when they meet, they're provided with that information. So here's what we think the flyway projections are, here's what the model says. People go into those meetings now, the decisions are almost automatic. It's institutionalized already. They're provided with information they're expecting, and it's usually not complicated. It's just certain numbers they're asking for. And then have you answered this uncertainty or this disagreement? Is harvest compensatory or is it additive? And it becomes part of the system and it becomes an everyday part of your life. And they're only provided with the information that they ask for. And it's a very reduced set. So we're not talking about every day going in. We're talking about there's a time period you need to make a decision. Tell us what information you want to have in front of you. And, you know, most of the managers, there's a few that really want the nitty gritty. What's this model doing? And a lot of times what they'll want to see is, I want you to play out what we just did in the last X years and run that through your model and tell me what I did wrong or right, something like that. And if you can at least keep it within bounds that they can start believing in it, they don't care too much about the details. What I find is that a lot of the stakeholders, the general public, and then the scientists, they want to know they are in the weeds on this stuff. That's where all this information is. But usually try to provide just an upper level summary for folks and some indication of how certain are you or, you know, don't know or bad sort of thing. Very simple, red, green, yellow, things like that for, you know, telling them what the effect might be and the level of uncertainty might be.
I think you present a very ideal integrated model system, you know, integrate management and science, you know, research, monitoring. But in practical speaking, there's a lot of situation on the monitoring work and the management work is restricted by legal requirement. So that really decided resources, budget, everything. So we cannot achieve optimal result by the ideal situation. How could you address that problem?
Legal things are always a constraint on the group unless we can get some relaxation. And the groups I work with, the ones that tend to be most restricted by law is when I work with Park Service folks, because they have specific mandates they need to do. So we have to try to work within those frameworks. So that, I don't know what else you can do unless you can find a way to break out of that framework. But sometimes people see things as complicated and constrained when there might be an alternative way to look at things. So part of the structured decision-making process is all about, it's all about creative decision-making. So let me give you an example. In the Savannah River in Georgia, South Carolina border, there's a series of impoundments. One of them is a pump back operation, or was going to be, it's coming online now. It was not functioning as a pump back operation, which means you generate power during peak hours, you pump the water back up into the reservoir during non-peak hours, so you're just making money with that thing. Before they started running it, it was a hypoluminic release, cold water. A striped bass fishery happened in that area. It was a very popular striped bass fishery because the cold water was there. Met with the Army Corps of Engineers, a bunch of biologists, and what are they doing? They're arguing about how do we keep, they figured out that if they do the pump back operation, it's going to warm the water up. So everybody was focusing, how do we cool the water down? How do we keep the fishery going? Maybe we get a white bass fishery going here. Maybe something that's more thermally tolerant. How do we do this? So finally somebody said, why don't we just move the fishery? Why don't we just move this down the lake where there's cold water? Well, there's cold water there, but there's no oxygen in that water. Okay, that becomes a totally different problem. So a lot of times groups get caught in this sort of group think and they get this tunnel vision because they're so close to the problem. What I do sometimes, I come in there and we try to think about how we're going to do it. In that instance, the Corps said we can inject oxygen into this deep water layer farther down the lake where there's cold water. It can be cold, oxygenated water. We've just moved the fishery down there. So we don't have to worry about the forebay or the pump back operation. They still have a functioning fishery going on. So sometimes that happens too, but there are other times when you just can't do something. You can't, you know, you don't have the legal mandate to change something.
Relative to all this, you've been around here a while now. How are we doing here in the Bay Delta? And if we aren't where we should be, let's say, how do you get there? What's the next What are the next few steps?
I could tell you what we did with the CVPIA. How's that? And then tell you we're starting a new effort here, starting tomorrow. So with the CVPIA, it's not easy. You got to get together with this group. You got to get together your stakeholder group and work with them and work with some of them consist of managers and scientists, set up a framework, an actual governance type system and a framework for how we're going to make decisions and work with that group and work with that group. It's all about face time. And somebody keeps telling me, well, it's a complicated problem. No, the math is easy. The modeling is easy. It's the people. That's the hard part. That's where everything falls apart is the people. So what I insist on is a lot of face time, because what happens is the people that participate have to own that process. So if they're not providing dollars or other resources, they're providing their time. What you find out now, things are running really well, Caesar, for us, is that people that are on this group, this stakeholder science group, they now own this. They own the process. They own at least the Chinook model that they're working on, and we're bringing in other peoples with other taxa that we're putting tools together. So what happens? It's slow, and I can see the little light at the end of the tunnel for this group because they're making progress, but it's slow. And for the Delta program, we're going to try the same thing, and we'll see where it goes. And it's going to be important that we keep people on board, but we make progress. So we're going to set up some kind of, here's how we make decisions. Here's how we decide how we're going to decide. And then we move forward from that, and then ask people, what can you, if you're part of this stakeholder group, whatever it is, what investment are you going to make in this process? You know, what do you want to achieve? What do you care about? And then work from there. And that's pretty much how it works. And I've done this, I don't know, 50, 60 times maybe in terms of projects. And they always start out that way. And each group is individual and unique in how they progress. I've gone through a couple of these where it's taken a week to slap together a full model and a whole system about how we're going to handle data to update things. That's super short. And then with other groups, it's taken, 2 years, 3 years to do it. So I think they can do it. I think they can do better than they're doing right now. And I think it's going to take a lot of help from a lot of other people and some hard work to pull it all together.
You introduced the concept of reducible and irreducible uncertainty. Have you ever encountered systems where the irreducible uncertainty is so great that it overwhelms everything else in the system?
So usually, there's this little rule in decision modeling, and what we try to focus on is those uncertainties that affect what decision you would make. They change the identity of the decision, what you think is the best decision. And you could have models with 1,000 parameters, and it's going to only be a handful that are really going to be important. So to give you an example of that. So you talk about there's a lot of uncertainty. Yeah, sure, there's a lot of uncertainty, but there's only a few uncertainties that you really care about that you need to really nail down. I had a student that put together a model for managing a recovery of the Klamath Lake suckers. And he had like 100 and some odd parameters in there. I'm like, Miguel, what is taking you so long to finish your thesis? Well, Jim, only a few of them are coming out as important. Yes, it is. And people call it the rule of 6, but it's usually less than 10 things that they're going to largely drive the decision. So when you say there's a large amount of uncertainty, there might be a large amount of uncertainty about those 6 things, but out of all the uncertainties, there's a few, and you can target what they are. No, I wouldn't even hazard a guess there right now. When I work with a group, I never tell them what I think because I want to know what they think. And then we try to go from there. So if there's people in this room, they would be sitting in, and I'm not going to tell them what I think. I also am not familiar enough to even hazard a super duper guess as to what it is. I've heard a lot of opinions and different ideas of people that are really smart, that very much different how they think the system works. And I want to bring those disparate ideas together. So I generally don't show my cards.
You mentioned early on the 2 different approaches to looking at adaptive management, one using experiments, one using more monitoring data. Can you talk more about those and why you favor the monitoring approach, and if the experimental approach has some conditions or areas where it would be useful?
Well, you can incorporate experiments into the decision theoretic approach, but what it does is it does allow for opportunistic decision making. So I'll give you an example. I chaired the evaluation of the Grand Canyon Adaptive Management Group, and what happens to those folks is they get pushed around. They implemented an action, an experiment, removal of rainbow trout. Problem with that is because of lawsuits, they had to stop removing. So they didn't get the full experimental implementation. So a lot of that's pulled out of their hands, but there's opportunities to learn just based on natural variability in the system. And if they don't have it set up in a decision theoretic framework, they can't take advantage of those opportunities to say, listen, in an information theoretic framework, you can do the totally wrong decision as long as you keep track of what you did and then compare what you thought was going to happen with what actually did happen and revise and update as far as that goes. It could be an experiment too, but it doesn't require some formal experimental design. So that's why I tend to favor that one.
I think we're all out of time. Thank you very much.